It really is a delight to be able to speak in the final reading of the Local Government 2002 Amendment Bill. And despite the discussions that have taken place in the House today, our Local Government and Environment Select Committee has worked very well together on this bill. Obviously don't agree on everything, but I do want to just correct some of the misleading statements that have been made in the course of this debate. Our Chair, Chris Okenvold, always chairs this committee in such a fine, sound way, and this is yet another example of a government bill that we're pleased and proud to bring to the conclusion. So I just want to come back to a couple of points and just to remind the House that this bill is around increasing transparency, it's around allowing local government to be more accountable, but I do want to stress the point that this is about keeping local decisions in local government, because that's what builds strong communities. So I wanted to touch on a couple of the key areas, just really as a way of summarising, I guess, Mr. Speaker. And the first is around core services, and I was fairly staggered to hear one of the previous Labor speakers talking about the fact that 97% of council spending is on core services, because, Mr. Speaker, that is not at all the messages I've had from the 3 district councils in the Taupō electorate. What they do, like the local councils, is the ability to be able to respond to their constituents, to the people who live in their communities, and to make decisions based on priorities that suit them. That's obviously once they've taken into account the core services, things like obviously sewerage and roading as a couple of examples. So the councils aren't restricted just to these core activities, but it will create a sense of priority on the ones that are defined in the bill as core. Now moving to financial management, there was actually general agreement from the submitters around the fact that it makes sense that a local council should be able to be more transparent in terms of how the council's funded, and to have some more consistency around financial management. We've heard about the defined fiscal envelope. Mr. Speaker, what that does, it allows a council to make a decision about what their own constraints are, and I think from some of the speeches we've heard, one might be listening and thinking that this is a central government imposition of a constraint, but it's not at all. It's a set of boundaries that each council puts around its own spending. And I do want to say that this is really important to the constituents of the Taupō electorate, and I'm sure they are up and down the country, who are concerned about further increases in their rates when their incomes are not growing accordingly. The pre-election report, I think, is a really important and a very valuable addition to local government, and we were fortunate to have some examples brought of some of the reporting that local governments provide. One example was from the South Waikato District Council in the Taupō electorate, and they're presenting plain English information about how the council's doing, and in a format that the majority of voters are able to understand. And I think that's a really important part of it. Yes, there are annual plans, yes, there's the long-term council plan, yes, there's the annual report. Some of the information currently in those is pretty highbrow, and I don't think you should have an accounting degree to be able to understand the books of the community in which you live and pay rates. So one of the important changes, though, that we did make in the Select Committee process is the recognition that councils come in different sizes and shapes, and therefore the ability for councils with less than 20,000 people, we removed some of the requirements for them to do it. Around performance measures, this is one in particular that I'm very proud of, having worked in a city council when performance measures were put in place. What this does is basically allow for councils up and down the country to have the same measures, so that ratepayers can actually compare how their council is doing. And, you know, there was a bit of hue and cry, and you would have thought that the sky was falling in from the opposition in terms of how hard this is going to be. But if you actually look at some of the Department of Internal Affairs existing reports, some of this information is available, and the focus really will be indicators that are relevant to the public and that they are able to see are of value in them assessing how their own council is doing. And they pay rates, so I think it's fair enough that they have the ability, Mr. Speaker, to see how their council is performing and how that money is being spent. The final thing that I do want to just bring to the House's attention is the issue around water assets. And this comes back to the point I made about the fact that we recognise on this side of the House that local governments come in different shapes and sizes. So do their demographics, so do the geographics, and so therefore the decisions around infrastructure for things like water are very, very different from one district council to the next. And that's something that we recognise and have in this bill allowed the flexibility if a council chooses, and I'm going to say the word chooses again, if a council chooses to contract out water services, it now has the ability to do that for 35 years. And the focus there is again, a council managing its infrastructure planning, managing its asset plans, managing the debt that might go onto ratepayers, giving them the flexibility to deal with their infrastructure commitments in a way that suits them. So this is not privatisation. It is not privatisation. Actually, this side of the House, we don't think the private sector is the big, bad, ugly monster. We actually think they do some things well, and we're actually, through this legislation, allowing them to do a bit more if the council chooses. If the council chooses. It's called a democracy, local government, if the council chooses. So it is not privatisation. Contracting out provides better ways, more flexible ways of a council managing the assets if they want to. So 35 years for some councils, if they choose, will allow them to better plan over the longer term for capital projects and is in line actually with the Land Transport Act. So there's some consistency in what we're doing with this bill. So, Mr Speaker, I'm very proud to support in the final reading this fantastic piece of legislation by our very able Minister for Local Government, Rodney Hyde, and I'm very excited about supporting this bill. Thank you, Mr Speaker.